Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Peace and safety to everybody out there in the world right now. Stuff's crazy, but it's always going to be crazy. The story, the narration, it's always meant to keep us. And it's hard to even get too worked up or excited because never in history have we known the whole story. Never has any group of people, especially the masses, been right on spot on knowing what's going on. And so if I feel like I'm being herded too strongly in one way, there's a part of me that naturally resists that. I'm just like, it's never been good to be part of that crew that just believes what they're told. History's never really looked back on those people fondly. They've usually been very naive. But peace and safety to all my people, all citizens, all innocents. You know, peace to even those who carry guns, man. It's not the soldiers that are behind this shit. You know, they're victims as well. And so peace to go to both sides. Let's just hope the aggression and the militant stuff stops soon, and some kind of a negotiation, compromise can come into place. And ultimately, that's what's being bargained here, some kind of negotiation that we're not privy to. The chances that blood's on our hands as well here in the West, for having manipulated this with the expansion of NATO, and there's no way geopolitics exists in a vacuum, and it's always been proven that there's blood on both sides, and manipulation is going every which direction. But I get asked a lot of times what's my favorite jazz record. I often get asked what record best defines the sounds of jazz. It's a tough question, being that there's so many different eras and so many different subgenres within the jazz kingdom. So what record really embodies jazz? As if you've never heard jazz before and you wanted to show someone this is what jazz is, I hope you wouldn't want to pick Eric Dolphy out to lunch, because you're giving them an angle that's not for everyone, first of all. And second of all, it represents a small part of the jazz legacy. So you want to try to find something that's going to really draw somebody in, capture the elements of improvisation, some of the elements of composition, some of the elements of just great virtuoso and solo. You want to have that life, that blues, all of it coming out, and have it be vibrant, and most of all fun, because jazz was always a fun thing before it became all the things that it was turned into. And I've been going back and forth on this with several other records. I think Kind of Blue is a great place to come in, which is where most people do come in, I think. And it's also one of the coolest records. And even though it's not really considered a cool record by the definition of West Coast cool, I think as far as what cool actually sounds and looks like, is cooler than most of the West Coast cool that's out there. That's a cool record with a melancholic vibe that's just addicting and enticing. It just sucks you in. It goes by so fast, even though the songs are long. It's just such a perfect record. But it's missing some of the blues. It's missing some of the elements that I think jazz is. And there's other records I've contemplated, a Blakey record or two, but they're so rooted in hard bop, which has, links to what came and what's after. But I think at the end of the day, a record I've just loved for years and never really could get enough of it. I always want to kind of live in that space when I hear it. It takes me to a lot of different places, brings a smile to my face always. And I think if I had to say to any person, if you want to have one jazz record that gives you an idea of what jazz is and potentially can be, and will illuminate most of the corners of the puzzle. It's not going to give you all the image, but it's going to give you most of the corners, the edges, so you know, wow, there's a lot of space within this world. And for me, it's really hard to pick a better record than this Duke Ellington record, Blues in Orbit. Recorded early in '60, if I remember, late '59. It's Duke, kind of at the peak of his I don't want to say peak of his talents, because his talent was always kind of omnipresent. But at the peak of a resurgence, for sure. Newport kind of brought him back into the landscape. Columbia is now issuing new material by him, plus older vault material at the same time. So there's a lot of stuff coming out by Ellington on Columbia at this point. Columbia has the ability to reach every nook and cranny of the country, you know. And so you could be in a pawn shop in New Mexico. You could be in a alleyway garage sale in Tallahassee. You can be in Buffalo, New York. It doesn't really matter. Columbia is going to be available in your Kmart's and your local music stores and Woolworths and all the different music places that were selling records in those days. Columbia Records were going to have distribution there. And so Ellington was something that was very popular at this point, in part because Newport brought him back into the limelight, and that record got a lot of praise in the community and kind of crossed over into the pop world some. This is him having just a great time with his man. His band at this point is one of the greatest assemblages of musicians. You have the great Jimmy Hamilton on the clarinet, who's a great composer as well. The great Johnny Hodges, my goodness. Ray Nance, Booty Wood on trombone, Matthew G. Jr. on the trombone, Paul Gonsalves on the tenor, Harry Carney on the baritone. It's just a pretty insane. Jimmy Wood on the bass. On the drums, I think we have Sam Woodyard. I see the drummer listed here. Bass. Where's the drummer? They're listing mostly the soloists here, I guess. So that's why they probably don't have the drummer listed. But they do. They list every one of the soloists on every song, which is kind of a cool thing to do. This is called 3J's Blues. And I'm guessing it's about Jimmy Hamilton, Johnny Hodges, and I'm not sure who the third J is. Probably goes back to an earlier recording or writing when there was another member of the group that was on that number. But Smada, Pig's Eye Blues. Sorry, it's Pie Eye Blues. Sweet and Pungent. What a great song. And you hear that term, sweet and pungent. You want something that sounds kind of like this. And you want some dissonance. You want some edge. Some Mingus, some Dolphy. Ellington's that bridge. And there's lots of dissonance and arrangement and composition and improvisation and swing and the blues and the black church. That's some interesting avant-garde right there. And then that's Booty Wood on the trombone, it sounds like. Incredible. It's just the blues talking to you. The reverend behind the pulpit. I get an amen. It's the black church, the blues is drenched throughout Ellington's catalog. So you never get too far away from those elements that almost have to be present for something to be jazz. He never lets it not swing. Just a brilliant composer. For those of you not super familiar with Duke Ellington, he goes back to the 20s. Was a very prominent figure in New York on the Cotton Club. He'd also play for black folks in other venues because Cotton Club was segregated most of those years. A lot of the greatest band members came through his orchestra. Many stayed for decades. He was from the Washington, D.C. area. Just a very suave, debonair man. And his music embodies class. And embodies a certain element of there's no way you can't respect me when I prepare what I'm preparing for you right here. See what I'm saying? It's such a high level of execution and sonic brilliance that when you open your ears and your mind to what Ellington's about, you can't dismiss him. And in doing so, you're acknowledging a recognition of black ability and talent and a class and a sophistication that our scholars and scribes had tried to make us believe they weren't capable of. And so to be able to come back at that world, not with words, but with a demonstration of my sophistication, my ability to be this incredibly enticing and alluring and interesting thing, filled with sexual, sensual pulse, and it just breathes atmosphere. And sweet and pungent, that's the smell of some well-perfumed sex parts. You know what I mean? It's what it is, sweet and pungent. What else you describe it? You ain't eating sweet and pungent. At least not for dinner. Sweet and pungent, that's describing something else. And jazz is always on that cusp of innuendo, of sexual compulsion. It's driven by that alluring sound of the groove. And honestly, it's why white parents were so afraid of this music. This next song is called Sea Jam Blues. Just a cooker. You know, all the different elements on this record. It goes from just hard swinging stuff to some of the bluesiest, stinkiest stuff you've ever heard. Some of the most just wonderful diminished chords and luxurious minors and resilient majors. And his composition is so brilliant. His counter melodies are so creative. His ability to create interesting complexity through simple things is unparalleled. And it's such a rewarding experience. And Ellington, to me, is at his best here. And that's a tall thing to say. Because, you know, he through the war years, up to the recording band, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, he was making some incredible recordings with that group then. And before that, with his jungle music from the 20s, which he hated that term, but that's what he was labeled as. Through his great groups in the post-war 40s, or in the early 50s. But it's always so subtly composed and arranged. Yet it's not ever rigid or controlled. I mean, listen to the swing in that, and that violin. And that's Ray Nance, the trumpet player, who doubled on the violin at times. I want to flip this over because I want to show you some other tracks on this. But this record truly has something for everyone. Fantastic in a mellow tone. Again, minimal composition in there. It's so fantastic. And again, I don't want to have this episode be pulled out. If you don't have Blues in Orbit, do yourself a favor. Go online, go to Discogs, buy yourself a nice old copy of this record. It sounds immaculate. It's really well produced. It's really well arranged. The compositions are so perfect. And they never go to that place of stagnant water that some composition in jazz gets to, where it becomes too rigid, too formulated, too controlled by, oh, we have to, there's an arrangement coming, so everyone got to, it's very open. It's very gospel. And you get a lot of the call and response of the church. Preacher, choir. Preacher, choir. That's call and response. That's the black church. And so Ellington's taken all this from the black diaspora. He's borrowing from the white vernacular in terms of adding instruments that jazz doesn't always embody, in terms of adding orchestral sounds at times to his group, but always having the element of the blues and the swing and the gospel and the black church to permeate it all, to distill it to where it's this perfect balance of all things that jazz is potential. And that's a really unique thing. There's so few records I can think of that would really give you... See what I'm saying? It's just so filled with the luxuries of life. Harry Carney on the baritone is wonderful on this. That's Ray Nance on the trumpet. And again, I'm glad they list the soloists here, because the soloists... This is one of Ellington's fortes. The soloists embody their personalities so strongly in their soloing and within the composition, in part because Ellington wrote for soloists. He knew that this guy sounded different on the trumpet or the sax than this guy. And this guy's tone is fitting my ear, what I want to hear from that timbre. I'm gonna write this for him. And so a lot of times, even when members would change, if he was looking for a trumpet, he wasn't just looking for a trumpet. He wasn't just a virtuoso. He was looking to replace the guy that gave him that sound in his last group. And that guy gave me soft pastels and a great mute. So I need that kind of a guy in my next group. Blues and Blueprint, next song, fantastic. Little snapping of the finger. Famous interview with Ellington where he talks about he always got snap kind of behind the beat. Ellington's such an interesting person, and he's actually a very complicated character. And he's really a bad interview because he answers almost every question that's asked him with a question. And a lot of times you could tell he just thought the questions were stupid. And so he asked a stupid question right back and left them often speechless because, A, I think they felt called out on some level, and B, you can't really call out Duke Ellington. I mean, who the F are you to be able to challenge the great Duke Ellington? And I don't feel very many people had the authority, the moral compass, or the vernacular to take Ellington to task. Even the critics, I think, would be a little bit modest in their reviews of what he did. He was so highly held in esteem, and he never was stagnant, always reinventing himself, and all those wonderful alleys and styles he goes down, he does them all so well. I think Billy Strayhorn and his mother were the two people that could tell Duke something. And you get Duke on the wrong day and you couldn't tell Duke nothing, even Billy and Moms. But I think he loved his mom dearly. He was a mama's boy by his own admission. And he dressed like his mom still dressed him, with that tight vest and he put the silks together, you know what I'm saying? He could wear a scarf and make it look like a man. He was a ladies' guy, but he seems like he was also fairly sexually open, and I am not privy to any deep intellectual information here, but Billy Strayhorn was an open gay homosexual, and I'm guessing they had to have some sort of a relationship, and it involved women all throughout that juncture as well for Duke. So if anything, he was probably somewhat bisexual, but his music speaks to that. It's got a sexuality and a confidence and a bravado and a sensuality and a sensitivity that broad male ego can rarely effecate. He just has this ability to be tender, like I said, gentle, caressing, sympathetic, a lot of softer, more exposing type of emotions. Ellington's very comfortable speaking of those with great confidence and great security, which speaks a lot to who this man was as an openly open sexual male, black male in America during the 20s and 30s and 40s. What a crazy cross to bear. And there's got to be a lot of hidden darkness and sadness and stress and exhaustion. And you see a lot of that in Ellington by the time he gets to the 60s and 70s. The bags under his eyes, the years driving around in buses. What a hard-working guy he was, not just in terms of composition and recording, but his touring schedule was just nonstop. And they zigzagged across the country, playing all sorts of things. And by the 60s, they were often reduced to playing in like high school gymnasiums and old retirement homes. And what a great song this is. This is called Swingers Get the Blues, too. And it starts with the blues. And then it's going to jump off into one of the great swing pulses that I've ever heard. It's got such feel. And again, it's not about the notes. It's how you play the notes. It's not about the composition. It's about the feeling behind the playing of the playback. And you can't help but feel, uh, who that would that be? Matthew G. Jr. right there, Matthew G. I'm a big Matthew G. guy. Matthew G. I'm not sure how it's said. He has a record on Riverside that's really hard to find. It's a great record. Ready? Let's pulse it. Ellington just simple, little basic. The Pink Panther couldn't be as cool as the Pink Panther was without this textbook being written. Like, so much of what we think of as jazz in the positive way is the Duke. And when I say in the positive way, there's two sets of thinking in the mainstream person's mindset about jazz. One is it's a cool thing, or two, it's kind of an excruciating artistic thing. And people are either in one of those two camps in terms of how they perceive what jazz is. Sometimes people think it's both, but the coolness of this, it's what creates the cool. It's what creates a lot of what happens in hard bop and post bop, and even with the modal playing that you get on Kind of Blue. Again, the blues is such an interesting backdrop to everything. And if you never get too far from the blues, your players will always retain that feeling. The feeling of a Matthew G right here blowing some sweet thunders of that trombone. That's syrupy, soft, caramel-like. And it's not about as many notes as I can play. It's about these are the perfect ones right here, watch. And composition is lacking in terms of feeling. You can't notate feeling. Rick Beato often talks about music today, how it's so rigid with its formulaic computer gritting that nothing has the blues to it because everything's straightened out, put on time, and the right in key. And blues needs to bend and come back to feel. Watch Gilmour bend those strings on Pink Floyd. He's bending those notes and then releasing them back up. That's feel. A singer dipping below and coming back up. Again, we're moving on to the next song now called The Swinger's Jump. And Ellington's just kind of giving you a light sprinkle there, and the soloists have fun with this one. Ray Nance, Johnny Hodges, Jimmy Hamilton. It's quite, just again, what a great lineup. Blues in Orbits coming up after this. Again, the soft pastoral, diminished minors. Ellington tinkling on the ivories up there, sprinkling some fairy pixie dust for you. And Ellington understood minimalism as good as anybody. Ellington understands space as good as anybody. And so much of what the elusive term jazz defines is encaptured on this record brilliantly. It's Jazz 101. It's the beginning and the middle and the end in every sense of the way. And you can hear everything on here from Armstrong to Mingus. You know what I mean? You can just hear all the elements that exist through 50 years of this music. And here's Ellington, 2/3 of the way through his own journey, still being cutting edge, still being this incredible voluminous jar that can take in everything that's happening in jazz around him and reprocess it for the present. And also process it in such a way that it's going to stay contemporary. It's going to stay modern. It's going to stay hip. And very, very few artists in any genre can defy, the movement of time. Time ends up codifying your place in the music canon more than most things. A lot of people get caught up using modern production of that current moment, which will sound dated always in 10, 20 years. Big mistake. You know, something like Amy Winehouse or even Adele, because she's using conventional instruments, it's not going to have a date to it per se. It's going to sound like music. When you start using the sounds of modern production and every little gimmick that's hot right now, nothing's going to make you sound more part of a sound or an era than those gimmicks. And Ellington never falls prey to that stuff. He's such a omnipresent, omniscient figure. And it's always with such grace and style and personality and passion and connection. And there's always this sense of being an ambassador for himself as a bisexual and as a black male. He's always carrying himself with such a degree of sophistication and austerity and self-empowerment that it's hard to challenge those people. You see someone walking with great confidence down the street, wearing something you would never wear, but they're wearing that silver lame suit with the top hat. There's cats I used to see in my old neighborhood, Minneapolis, uptown, that would just dress with this weird personality. There's one guy that he was actually a French or Belgian guy who lived in the neighborhood, and he had this round blended like glasses, and he wore clothing that was very unconventional and out of sync with what was happening. But he did it with such panache and such confidence that it always made him look the flyest cat in the room. Always. No matter what was cool, he was always cooler. And so Ellington is not this product of the bygone era that is no longer relevant. He's absolutely a contemporary with all the cats that are happening in the scene. He's playing with John Coltrane. He's playing with Coleman Hawkins. He's playing with so many of the young hip cats like Mingus and Max Roach on the Money Jungle, which isn't one of my favorite Ellington records. Some good playing on there, but they sound a little out of sync at times. But I don't think United Artists really gave them much of a chance to really put that record together. But Ellington, like I said, is just such a omnipresent, universal figure in the music. And it's something that we should all recognize, and we should all own as much Ellington as we can find. He's such an important architect, such an important pillar, and he's one of the founding fathers on the Mount Rushmore of jazz without any question. Ellington's just this giant figure that I think a lot of us get reduced to thinking he's in a certain mold, but he's not. He's a very broad palette of sound and color that fills up every parameter of the songbook, and his gift to the American Republic is one of the greatest songbooks ever composed or arranged. And the numbers range from 2,000 to 2,500 pieces of music he composed and arranged. And what's crazy is a lot of those songs are so legendary that he re-recorded them himself often with later bands, so they sounded different. So you have multiple versions of a lot of these great songs by this great orchestra. And so there's not just one version of Take the A Train, there's numerous. There's not just one great version of In a Sentimental Mood, there's numerous. And then everybody and their uncle. Ellington is to jazz songbook what Bob Dylan is to rock. Everybody does a Dylan song. Everybody does Ellington. Everybody does Ellington. And you might not put it on your record, but you played it live. You know what I mean? You always want to touch some of those great songs that he was, because they captured, and they're beautiful. They're beautiful. He understands melody. He understands emotion and giving you something that's got guts to it. And so you could be the most avant-garde guy and still find a great deal of value in what Duke Ellington had to offer. Even Mingus, and if I remember, Mingus was a member briefly, and he got fired pretty quickly. It could have been with Basie, but I think it was with Ellington. So it's interesting that they got together again in '58 or whatever it is at United Artists for that Money Jungle, because I think Ellington dismissed him rather curtly. Mingus was not a guy that really ever had a captain, and he had a hard time being a captain to himself. Mingus was a fairly large pariah on the scene, and I think in some ways, some of the jazz critics and some of the jazz paparazzi, glitterati, just the people who pronounce who matters in jazz, I think Mingus's standoffish asshole behavior often alienated himself, and I think a lot of the critics and reviewers and historians either love him or hate him. And so I think he gets omitted sometimes from the story, in part because of his personality and behavior. He became hard to want to support, which is too bad because you take Monk and you take Ellington, and you really kind of get a Mingus out of that. Mingus is such an important stepping stone to what happens in the avant-garde in the 60s. Listen to a song like Pithecanthropus erectus on Atlantic from 56 and just see how ahead of the curve a guy like Charlie Mingus is on the West Coast. Again, Jimmy Joffrey's on the West Coast doing pretty advanced stuff. So there was actually more avant-garde happening. Jerry Mulligan was dabbling in some interesting compositions. And so Mingus is on the West Coast being part of that. Cool. And the Cool often had some really interesting composition and some interesting arrangement, interesting musicians with interesting instruments. They could put a French horn and a tuba in some Cool. They were doing, Chico Hamilton was using cello on some of his Cool. So there's interesting things that were happening within West Coast sounds. And so much of what's happening on the West Coast doesn't really fit that West Cool label. It's more just modern post-bop stuff. And Cool got labeled across a broad swath, which a lot of it doesn't really have cool to it. And this would never have been labeled cool by anyone, and yet it's actually got a lot of cool in it. Cool, soft blues with pastel sounds and melancholic flavor. That's kind of the Cool. And so as cool as kind of blue is, Blues in Orbit is every bit as cool. And should be in every collection next to your kind of blue Miles Davis, next to your Dave Brubeck Time Out, next to your Mingus Aum. Again, this is from the same time frame, 5960. Columbia is doing some incredible jazz right here at this moment. They really are on the cutting edge. It took them to 5960 to get there. So they're well behind the curve in terms of being a leading sound of what jazz was doing. They never really were that much up until this moment. They kind of waited and picked out the artists who white America was okay with, mostly who were white jazz players, and they would pick out the more experienced veteran black players who had kind of made their way across into the kingdom that white people were accepting, guys like Armstrong, guys like Ellington. But here, Columbia really is kind of saying, okay, let's be a leading voice in what jazz is about. And they don't really stay there very long, in part because jazz starts to take off in so many different directions, and Columbia being concerned with bottom lines and distribution and making money, you weren't going to put some of those records that came out in the 60s on Columbia no matter what. But still, Columbia deserves credit for what they were doing in the late 50s with Miles Davis, bringing Monk over, the early Jazz Messenger stuff in 56 and 57 in there. Those are really important records. Again, bringing black jazz music to America, which was one of the things we don't really understand or perceive from our present viewpoint, is that how many of these great little black labels or independent jazz labels weren't really a nationally distributed thing that everyone had access to. You had access to Capitol, Columbia, Decca, maybe Verve, because Verve had a bit of a bigger distribution. Mercury could push those Emerson records across the country pretty well. But early Emerson, that's definitely not the case. They kind of grow into that, So Columbia did a great job in exposing America to a lot of wider sounds. Y'all be safe. You have a great day. Please support the channel. Go to Patreon if you want to help out, or buy a t-shirt or a hoodie in the merch store below in the description. It's always appreciated. Hit that thumbs up if you like the content. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Every bit of that support matters. It helps grow my algorithm, I guess, and get my name out there. I'd like to see these episodes getting a lot more views than they get. A, because it'd be good for me, but B, because I think it's important that we talk about this era of jazz more. And from a lot of people telling me this is one of the best channels for that vintage era of jazz, the 30s through up to 1970 or so. That's really where my focus is going to be. And I'll touch on stuff that happens later from time to time. And I'll even do episodes on things once in a while that are from a later time. But I don't really feel that I'm speaking from an area of expertise once I get past 1970. I can speak on CTI pretty good, and I can speak on some of the fusion, crossover, rhythm and blues jazz, but I don't really spend a lot of time delving into a lot of that stuff that was recorded on the edges in that era anymore. A lot of the traditional stuff seems kind of boring and soulless, kind of weak baby food as you were. So again, jazz's potency to me is here when it's on the cutting edge of the social movements, the political movements, the civil rights movement. Jazz is at this fulcrum where the tension and the danger and the propulsion and the composition are all weaving this tale of Americana. And that's where the challenge kind of always going to be focused on. So y'all be safe. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.